Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. And what we're going to be talking about is family business. For some people, it might be helpful if some individuals do what is known in the military as stand down. Stand down is basically an admonition to relax. Just let go a little bit. Some individuals are a little overwrought about the issue of ADOS and pretty much having a conniption fit all over the internet. All of that is unnecessary. What we're going to be talking about is we're going to look at the construct of ADOS, and we're going to look at it as a distinct legal class. We're going to look at the law of estates and descendancy. We're going to look at succession. We're going to look at something called heirship, including bodily heirs or heirs of the body. We're going to look at lineal descent versus collateral descent, and that's what people are talking about when they're talking about being an American descendant of slavery. We're also going to look at who can actually be an ADOS, and we're going to look at the issue of allies and enemies. That dynamic keeps coming up in conversation. We're also going to look at who can inherit from an ADOS and whether the class of ADOS is an exclusionary class. And we're also going to look at a really quick historical note on what is known as the Harvard descendants. And we are going to use Prince, or the artist formerly known as Prince, as a case study example in terms of understanding this dynamic of ADOS. And so we're going to start off with some of that. We're going to also look at a genogram so that you can get a better picture of this idea of ADOS and this idea of legacy and descent. And additionally, in keeping with Kanye West's admonition about this is family business, we're also going to use Kanye as a part of the case study along with Prince. And as a quick reminder, if this video appears anywhere other than Dr. Tracey McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized, and that includes anyone's Instagram page and Facebook and all of these other coli or coli, all of those places. All right, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started with this genogram. And so genograms are often used in the mental health field and also in coaching, so that you can kind of get a picture of the family. And so you can look at the descent, you can look at the lineal descent, you can look at the collateral descent, depending on how big you make the genogram. And so you can see at the bottom you have the child, and you can just sort of go up, and you go up further up the line, so it's really ascendancy, but you go up and you have the grandparents and the great-grandparents. And this is really great for those of you who are doing genealogical work, so that you can actually map out your ancestry. And those of you who are claiming ADOS identity, you are going to need to do this. And so you might want to get some copies and make some copies of something like this, so that you can start to plot your family on the chart. And so in terms of ADOS, what you're talking about primarily is a group of individuals, and we're going to talk about that group, this dynamic of a class, that were descended from those who were enslaved or during that slavery time frame. And so you definitely want to show, if at all possible, that your ancestors, you have an ancestor that goes back into the time of slavery. And so slavery, technically, there was an initiative that started with the Civil War of ending slavery. So if at all possible, you want to get back into at least 1861, April 11th, 1861, and at the latest, 1941, because that would be the end of the slavery via convict leasing. And so technically that's when it pretty much was supposed to stop legally. Again, if those of you who recall the discussion about the 13th Amendment, you will recall that slavery has not actually ended. And so they were able to continue to enslave people based upon that. And so some of the identifiers that you might see when you're looking at census records and things like that in terms of your ancestors to indicate or suggest that they might have been enslaved would be things like Black, Negro, Colored, Mulatto, Indian, Creole, and you might even see things like Black Dutch and Black Irish. And so that gives you the Black Scots. So that also gives you an indication that the individual was understood as Black or Negro or Colored or Mulatto or Indian or Creole. And I do want to add this because there's so much consternation going on and so much attention being paid to ADOS. I don't know what that's all about, but anyway, so there's a lot of attention being paid and a lot of criticism, critique, all sorts of involvement, and that really is unnecessary. So let me just point out this because this is part of the consternation. If an individual, their family was not in this time frame, they don't have ancestors in this time frame, they have ancestors that are in that time frame from somewhere. And so if they are looking for this restorative justice and they have ancestors who were in Antigua, for instance, or in Jamaica, for instance, then CARICOM would be the entity that they would be using to pursue restorative justice. And so everyone doesn't need to be included in this particular class. And so you just need to find out where your family is and then pursue things based upon where your family was at that time. So it's not really a big deal. People are making a really big deal out of this and getting all bent out of shape about who's going to get what and who can pursue what and who has what identity, and it's just really unnecessary. So everybody just stand down, just relax. Again, so if your family if you're descended from individuals who were enslaved or were living during the time of slavery in the United States, then this would be including you. If your family was enslaved in some other sovereign, another country, Haiti, Dominican Republic, anywhere else, then that would be where you would be joining to seek some sort of relief. So there's room for everyone. There's a space for everyone. Okay, so we're going to look at some legal codes. We're just going to look at some legal language and legal constructs related to ADOS so that this will give you a better picture and language to use when you're discussing these dynamics, okay? Okay, so let's quickly talk about what an estate is. An estate is the net worth of an individual, whether the person is dead or alive. It is the assets that the person has. It's the legal rights that the person has. It's the person's legal interests and their entitlements to any type of property. And so when you're talking about your ancestors and you're talking about the estate or the assets or the legal rights or the legal interests of your ancestor, what you're talking about is their estate. Now, of course, the focus right now is on being the descendant. And so what is a descendant? So when you're talking about American descendants of chattel slavery, what are you talking about? You're basically talking about proceeding from an ancestor. And so it's someone who issues forth from someone else. And this is really important because when you're a descendant, it goes into infinity. And so your great, 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 great grandchildren are your descendants. They will be your descendants, and they will always be your descendants. And it doesn't matter how far away they get or how many generations you're talking about, those are your descendants. And when you're talking about bodily descendants, you're talking about heirs that came through you, through your body. So these are your descendants through your body, meaning they are biologically tied to you. And by the same token, this would apply to you in terms of your ancestors. And so it doesn't matter how far away you are from your ancestors from the 1300s, the 1200s, the 15, 16, 17, 1800s. Those are all your ancestors, your grandparents. And again, you can see here a fairly clear-cut definition of a descendant, something that is deriving from something earlier. And so something that is coming from an ancestor, something that is coming from a root. And so the descendants would be the branches and the fruit from the root. And another word that you might see might be scion, and that's the offspring or the descendant. It's the same thing. Often this, however, is used to sort of mark children who are from royal blood or from nobility, and so you'll see that word used for them. All right, so when you're talking about being a descendant of slavery, what you're talking about is the law related to descent and distribution. And this is an area of law that relates to the transfer of property. And so it's the property of a decedent, someone who is deceased. And when you're talking about someone who's deceased, and particularly in this situation, you're talking about the interests and rights of an ancestor where there was no will. And so it would be sort of what's called intestate succession. And so that's what you're really talking about when you're talking about this idea of being a descendant. You're talking about having these rights related to being a descendant of the decedent. And so this is not about culture. This isn't about a social class. This is about the bloodline. And so again, what people are really talking about or looking at is this idea of succession, and it is what is passed down after the ancestor's death. And so it's the property and the legal rights. It's also the responsibilities too, but it is that passing down after death of the property or the rights or the interest of the ancestor. And one of the things to note is in Louisiana, which has a totally different legal system going on, the heir steps into the shoes of the deceased very specifically. And it's almost impossible to disinherit an heir in Louisiana. And when you hear this word heir, it's just a sort of a fancy way of saying the person who succeeds by rules of law to the estate, and it's by descent from an ancestor. So it really is about that family relationship. It's not about being an ally. It's not about being a friend or an enemy. All of that does not matter. It's really about that family relationship and that law of succession. And so it's based upon the law. One of the things that frequently comes up related to restorative justice is this issue of dynastic wealth. And dynastic wealth is basically talking about this idea of monetary inheritance that's passed on to generations that did not earn it. And so they just inherited it. They have it based upon their position as a descendant. And so it has nothing to do with anything that they've done. And so that would include those who've been unjustly enriched and those who have been deprived of what they should have inherited from their ancestors. And as many of you recall, this is going to be our case study. As many of you recall, when the artist formerly known as Prince, also Prince, passed, there was a lot of turmoil regarding his estate. So you know what an estate is now. So there was a lot of turmoil related to his estate and the identification of the heirs. And so those would be the people who would inherit. And so this is based upon the law of the states. And so each state is going to have something a little different in terms of this type of law. And you might use words like probate and estate law, trusts and estates, wills. And so those will be some terms that you would see when you're talking about this type of law in terms of succession. And so they were able to narrow it down. But one of the interesting things to note, for you to note, is that this really is about heirship, and it's about inclusion and exclusion. And so that's something that you all have been talking about in terms of being an ADOS. So it's about inclusion and exclusion. And so what the court does is it figures out who needs to be included in this heir class, and then who needs to be excluded in terms of the heir class. This, again, is not about religion, ideology, philosophy. It's not about any of that. It's really about, in this case, it's about biology. And so that's what they are looking to do. They're trying to figure out who they're going to exclude and who they are going to include legally. Who is entitled, not who feels like they should be receiving something, but who is legitimately entitled in terms of being the heir of Prince. And as you might recall, there were a lot of people coming out of the woodwork identifying themselves as potential heirs. And so the court had to, parse this dynamic and figure out, who actually was an heir or a potential heir and who was not. And so again, it's up to the court to figure out who appropriately should be included and who should be excluded. And so there are lots of people who think they should be included, but it really comes down to what the law says about who's supposed to be included, who actually is an heir. All right, so let's quickly talk about lineal descent, because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ADOS. You're talking about lineal descent, that direct line of descent. So it's children and their descendants. And so you have those great-great-great-grandparents, and then their children, and then their children, and then their children on down to you. And so that's what lineal descent is about. And so when you're talking about being that descendant, that's what people need to focus on in terms of the rights. Now, collateral descent is not as important, but it may be useful in terms of tracking your history, because let's say you can't find your direct lineal ancestors. Sometimes you can find ancestors by collateral descent, and so you can look for those relatives. So you might find in the census the sister or the brother of one of your ancestors, and so you can start to look at your heritage through that vantage point. And so again, this is really helpful in terms of doing your research, even though it is not exactly what you would need in terms of proving that lineal descent. So you really want to be able to prove that lineal descent, although collateral descent can also be used as proof. And so collateral descent is basically a relative who is a descendant of a brother or a sister of an ancestor. So you're looking at nieces and nephews and cousins. It's also related to what's known as the collateral heir. And so again, it's an heir who's not in the direct line of the deceased. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about quickly is bodily heirs, and these are also known as heirs of the body, and these are basically descendants of one's bloodline. And so these are definitely biological heirs, heirs of the body. If the bloodline runs out, the inheritance then reverts to the next relative traced back to the original owner of the property interest. And so there is an interest in law in keeping things within the family. And so they will look for heirs. They will trace things back and go back and forth with things, trying to find an heir so that there is someone who does receive from the decedent. I would encourage those of you who have not started to research your ancestors to also look at some of the laws related to succession and descent and distribution for the Indian law. So you can look at the U.S. Code because it's going to give you a pretty good idea of how this whole dynamic works in terms of figuring out who the heirs are and figuring out how things are distributed. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little quiz, and we're going to see if you remember certain things and if you're able to extrapolate and apply some of the things that you just learned to some other dynamics. And so let's get started with this. All right, just like this construct of Indian has been defined, what's going to need to happen is that there's going to need to be a legally defensible dynamic whereby you create a construct for American descendant of slavery. And so you need to have that operationalized. You know, what does it look like? And so if you're going to have it codified, what would that look like? And so some of the things you want to start thinking about is who is an Indian? Who is an ADOS? Who is a DACS? And so ADOS, of course, American descendant of slavery. That is not African descendant of slavery. I know people are playing all sorts of games with words, but that particular phrase is for American descendants of slavery. And then you have DACS, and some people actually use that, and that is descendants of American chattel slavery. And so they are being very specific because there are different types of slavery. And so that's something that you can parse as you dig into that, and you guys continue discussing these issues. Other questions. Can a person be an Indian, an ADOS, a DACS, and European? Are those related? People keep throwing out all of these, you know, what about this and what about that? And so these are questions that you need to start entertaining. Can a person be all of these different things? The answer is, of course, yes. One of the things that creates a lot of confusion is that people like to play around with words when they are creating confusion, and there are a lot of people right now who are attempting to create a lot of confusion around these dynamics. But basically what you're talking about are, it's just another way of saying, you know, Native Black Americans, Native Brown Americans, if that's what you want to use. You can also look at it as Native Colored Americans, because of course these are words that were used in the census, and so you do need to be in touch with that issue. So your ancestors may be, you know, have been identified in a number of ways. So they might have been identified as, you know, Colored Americans or Negro Americans. It's another way of saying first Black or first Brown or first Colored, first Mulatto, first Negro, first chattel enslaved Americans, you know, first individuals who were subjected to the Black Code. So Black Code descendant Americans, Native Black, Brown, Colored, Negro, Jim Crow Americans. And so it's those groups or those identifiers that you will be looking for in terms of finding your ancestors that are related to this identity of ADOS. Again, you have to remember that this is about biology, this is about family, this is about heirship, this is about the law of succession, this is about the law of descent in terms of you claiming rights that are related to ancestors. And so again, it's not about a social dynamic. So it can't be about, you know, Pan-Africanism. It can't be about any ideology. It really is about this, and it's about nothing else. And so entertaining conversations about all of these other things is not really going to get you anywhere. It's just going to be a distraction. And it's time you could be using looking for your ancestors. And so you pretty much have to put some of that other stuff on the back burner in terms of people wanting to argue about ideology and you know, all of these theories and things like that, because it really, you know, has no place in terms of the law. Okay, so again, these are the dates that you, you know, definitely you want to have some ancestors that were born in the United States during the time that slavery in some form or another was sanctioned, legitimized, legalized. And this is a twofold conversation. because you need to be thinking about these things, whether or not you're identifying yourself as an American Indian or an ADOS or a DACS. These are all biological classifications. They are also legal classes. And so you need to fall within the classification or the legal class in order to be identified as such. And so again, that needs to be your primary focus, is establishing that place within the class, because it's a very specific, as has been said, a very specific justice claim. And so you have to position yourself. It's not based upon your feelings. It's not based upon what you think or what you believe. It's based upon proof. Those of you who have been tracing your ancestors, and your ancestors were on the ADOS roll, for instance, you might have also seen the testimony that your ancestor provided. Some of you will see that testimony, and you will see that the Department of the Interior, they ask very specific questions about your family history. And so you got to learn, hopefully, a lot about your family in terms of the family dynamics. But those are the things that you would need to be answering in this situation where you would be asking for or demanding restorative justice. You're going to have to be able to demonstrate that you fit within that biological classification, that you fit within that legal class. And so that needs to be your primary focus, not arguing and debating about Pan-Africanism or the consciousness movement or any of those things, because those things they're inconsequential. They have no place in this discussion. All right, so let's quickly talk about what a legal class is. A class is all of the people that are in the same category. And so you think about a category of people. A category of people could be, all women, all men, all children. In this case, you're talking about all descendants of slavery in America, meaning the United States of America. The continental United States, or it could be, you could extend it beyond that to the territories of the United States. So just however you want to classify it, there needs to be a categorization of it. And so you're also looking at the people who have the same level of rights, so they have similar justice claims. And so you're looking for heirs of a deceased person related by the same degree. So you're looking for distant grandchildren and distant grandchildren of ancestors who suffered from the same type of incident. And so what you're looking for, again, is inclusion and exclusion. And so the inclusion determines who has the right to advance those legal claims on behalf of the class. And so this is where this also is very important. You need to make sure that when people are speaking for you, that they actually are in this class. And so there are a lot of people speaking right now who aren't even attempting to show that they are in this particular legal class. They're just speaking, so they just want to have a voice. But really, they don't have a voice technically. It's not like the law would listen to someone who does not fit within the class if they call themselves representing the class. If they don't have any standing, they don't have any standing. If they can't stand in someone's shoes in terms of an ancestor, then they have no standing in terms of a voice. And so one of the important things is you might want to start checking out these legislators who are representing your interest. If they are not ADOS and you are expecting them to advance the rights of the class, the legal class ADOS, you might be very disappointed. And so that's one of the things you might want to start looking at is, who is in Congressional Black Caucus and who is going to legitimately advance your legal interests. And if an individual does not feel connected to that class, they may not be as invested and they may not give it the legitimate attention that it deserves. Another construct is that of legacy, and legacy is basically a word that is talking about a class of individuals. Again, we're talking about a legal class, and so this is a class of individuals who will actually take the property, or they will take the interest. They will take whatever the ancestor was entitled to. And when you think about nobility, if you ever see a film related to nobility, you might hear things like heir apparent. And the heir apparent is the person who is expected to inherit. And so they are the person who is expected to receive a particular share of a family member's estate. Now, there have been a lot of questions about who can be an ADOS, who is an Indian, who is a DACS. And so let's simplify this. You should already know, in terms of this quiz question, the answer to that. And so if someone says, can a Democrat be an ADOS? The answer, of course, is yes. Can a Republican be a libertarian, a Pan-Africanist, a white nationalist, a socialist, capitalist, wealthy, poor, gay, lesbian, white passing, Muslim, Moor, Hebrew, Jew, Catholic, Baptist, African, European, Caribbean, biracial, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon? Can any of these people be ADOS, Indian, DACS? Of course they can, because being an ADOS is about lineage. It is not about any of these other things. Just think about your family. You have family members, of course, who are in different political parties. You have some wealthy and some poor family members, perhaps. You have family members who are of different religions. You have family members who are bicultural, so they've got one parent who is, from Guyana, and then another parent is from Alabama. And so, again, when you see that, yes, of course, then you can have an ADOS who happens to be Caribbean. You might have an ADOS person, and you can look at Kanye West as a perfect example, since we're, talking about family business. He has children who are considered bicultural, and since those children are bicultural, some people might call them biracial, they would inherit from Kanye West. And so even though their skin is lighter, it doesn't mean that they don't inherit, because they are his children. And so it's about that descendancy. It's about that lineage. It's about that bloodline. And people try to make it into something else, but legally you cannot make it into something else. And so you can have all sorts of ideologies. People can entertain whatever ideology they want to. The law is not going to recognize ideology. The law is going to recognize descent. Another thing that people throw out there is, can a non-ADOS, non-Indian, non-DACS spouse inherit from an ADOS, Indian DACS spouse? And the answer is, of course they can. A spouse definitely can inherit from their spouse, and the law does not take into consideration the skin color of the other spouse, the religion of the other spouse, the political ideology of the other spouse. It does not take into consideration those things. And quite frankly, people are concerned about this, but really people are a little overly concerned, because that's something that's not on their plate. Who someone else is married to is really no one else's business in terms of this issue of inheritance. Okay, another question that keeps coming up is, can a person be half ADOS? People will say, my child is half ADOS, or my cousin is half ADOS. There's no such thing as half ADOS. Okay, so when you're talking about your grandparents and you're talking about that lineal descent, grandparents don't have half grandchildren. Once you are a descendant, you are a descendant. There's no half, there's no third, there's none of that. You simply are a descendant. And so you may also be a descendant of another group of people, but you are simply a descendant. You're not a half of a descendant or a fourth of a descendant. And so when people are talking about bicultural types of dynamics, they might think that that also translates into the law, and it does not. There is no such thing as a half descendant. And the next question is ADOS / Indian / DACS, descendancy, exclusionary? Well, you know by now that the answer is yes. By law, it is exclusionary, and it has to be that way. Now, what's really interesting with CARICOM is you've got all of these different sovereigns, and the sovereigns all have different laws. Now, the United States is known as being exclusive, and so the United States does not have the same relationship with international law that some other countries do, and so it's called American exceptionalism. And so the things that CARICOM can do are not the same things that American descendants of slavery can do. And so the dynamics are different simply because the sovereign is different. And so that needs to be understood. So CARICOM is exclusionary, but it's exclusionary by design. And ADOS is exclusionary by law. And next, does the law of succession give sway to allies or enemies of the decedents? No, by law. The law of succession doesn't care anything about all of these social constructs such as allies and enemies of the decedent. It doesn't matter. It's great for people to have allies and friends, not so great to have enemies. However, it doesn't matter one way or the other when it comes to the law of succession. It's really just about that bloodline. It's really about that heirship. It's really about that descendancy. That's what it's all about. Now, some people believe that this idea of the descendants is something new. It's not something new. It's something that's been discussed for a long time. It's just, coming to a head right now with the efforts of very specific people who are pushing this forward and coordinating things and actually articulating the dynamics in a public sphere. And so this issue, however, related to the descendants and the marginalization of ADOS, particularly in academic institutions. So this is an article. This is from a New York Times article. It's a lengthier article, and we're actually going to do a video discussing this whole dynamic. But what was happening was that students who would be considered ADOS, they were dwindling. They are dwindling in the Ivy League institutions. And so there was an observation by a student, by many of the students at Harvard, the few ADOS students that were there, they were saying basically back in 2004, there were so few black students who were ADOS at Harvard that they started referring to themselves as the descendants. Now, as we wrap this up, we're going to touch on what is fueling some of this anti-ADOS, anti-Indian, anti-DACS sentiment. And there are a number of things. It depends on the individual or the individual group, what is fueling a lot of this. And I can tell you from listening to, observing some of the videos related to this anti-sentiment, that the sentiment also largely is anti-American sentiment. And so that's a big part of that dynamic. And so ADOS identifying as American, for individuals who are triggered by that, they are basically manifesting their anti-American sentiment. And so ADOS is sort of the representative of America, and so they are catching the majority of this turmoil. It's also indirectly anti-CARICOM because there is this, again, this sentiment, generally speaking, it's sort of anti-restorative justice, but the bigger sentiment is anti-American by and large. Many people are uninformed and they're just confused, so they haven't done their research to even find out what ADOS is or the history of ADOS. They think it's, a movement, like that's the crux of it. They think it's like a socio-political movement, and that's it. And so they believe they should have a voice, in the movement, not recognizing that it really is basically a legal class. And there are individuals who haven't done their research, and they, have the same feelings about Indians or the same feelings about what's considered DACS. And so again, it comes from being uninformed, and confused. Some of these people are speaking out of their spirit as being descendants of slave traders. And so they have a particular feeling. They may not even know why they have that particular feeling in this animosity towards the descendants. Then some individuals have been standing in for, just like the Harvard students are complaining about, they've been standing in for ADOS or being in their shoes or the shoes of Indians or DACS. And so they have a little bit of consternation going on about this idea of ADOS upsetting that apple cart. Another one is there are individuals who, in terms of their politics, they are, they're in operative mode. And so they've got this thing going on. They have a globalist mentality, and ADOS seems more nationalistic. And so they don't like that. They have a communist sort of mindset. So they don't like this ADOS capitalist sort of mindset. Again, some people are just scam artists, and so this is part of their scamming. They, have some agenda on social media or wherever. Some people are narcissistic gaslighters, and so they're just playing mind games with people, being distracting and things like that. Some people are just trolls. Some are significantly attention-seeking. They're individuals who are just oppositional defiant. It doesn't matter what identity a person has or what the agenda is. It doesn't matter. They are opposed to it. And so you'll notice this, if you're talking about Indians, they are doing videos, or they, have an entire propaganda machine going on, anti-Indian. If you're talking about ADOS, they've got an entire propaganda machine, anti-ADOS. And so they're just against anything. And so it has nothing to do with the merit of the dynamic. It just has to do with they just like being oppositional and attention seeking. And so another group might be individuals that, as you go forward with these discussions, these might be individuals who are like conscientious objectors to even being in an ADOS class, and perhaps you could create a role, they're abdicating the right of redress role. And so you can put them on that role. They can be placed over there, and, if anything happens, they can, stay right there and not be bothered with the rest of these dynamics. Anyway, hoping that you took some notes and that this information was helpful. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.
So sweet, like a photo where your granny's rich and that you're gone. It hit us super hard on Thanksgiving and Christmas. This can't be right. Yo, you heard the track I did, man. This can't be like. Somebody please.